In some of the poorest regions of my own country, we had a local development model, which was a partnership board which involved enterprise, people living in the community, and public authorities to try to breed the enterprising spirit and to break the cycle of poverty. And to a great extent that worked. It was an area-based partnership. And I saw that at work as well in Rwanda, where both the British and Dutch government land registries were working with local communities to register land. And I want to say something about this because I think this is something which could be central to breeding the enterprising spirit. I wrote the report on disaster risk reduction for the European Parliament in 2013. And I was very surprised when I came to write the report. It was the UN who persuaded me we needed to do something about this, that the European Commission, if you like, the governing body, the Parliament and the Council work a bit like the Congress and the Senate. They were using different language. They were talking about resilience and I was talking about DRR. Now we're all talking about resilience and disaster risk reduction and what a hazard is because we've taken the UN language. And I think that's an important thing, that we have common language. And for that reason, I think if we are to be successful in having a partnership between the public and private sector, there needs to be a framework or an ethos. And I want to mention two words which are not in the ownership of the socialists or of the left, and which we who are interested in enterprise have to put into our vocabulary. And those two words are social justice. In my belief, any framework which involves the public sector and the private sector must encourage enterprise and social justice, rights and responsibilities. Anybody can tell you can have social justice and rights. And in fact, it's a great badge to get elected on. You cannot have social justice if you do not have enterprise. A woman in a very poor part of Dublin convinced me of this. She said to me, "Gay, why does my husband go to work in the morning? The guy next door is a carpenter. He stays in bed all day. He goes to the bookie shop and the pub. He draws the dole on unemployment benefit. His rent in his project house is assessed on his known income, but actually he does what they call nixers on the side. He works and he gets paid for that. My husband's a labourer. He's gone at 6:30 in the morning, gets back at 6:30 in the evening. We don't get a medical card. Our rent is assessed on the gross income." Where's the justice in that? And I became convinced, and I am convinced, you cannot have social justice without encouraging enterprise. Enterprise and social justice go hand in glove. Command economies do not work. So I say to the business community here, do not be afraid of the word social justice. The best thing you can do for somebody in the area of social justice is to create a job or help them to create a job. So I think we need that ethos. And also to say, if you've got rights, you've got responsibilities. We've got responsibilities for ourselves, for each other, and to each other. And in that context, I think it's very important that we consider how the private sector might become, with the public sector, partners in the future. I know, for example, Dennis O'Brien in my own country, I happen to know Dennis, is very much involved, became very much involved in Haiti. ESAT Telecom were working there and he saw the devastation and he became personally very engaged in that. I know a man called Niall Mellon who annually brings teams of people from Ireland to build houses in Africa. I know people who've started a project in Ethiopia. They brought potato seeds from Ireland because we had a famine in Ireland in the 19th century to do with potatoes. And they created a cooperative. And every year, the people who got seeds must donate one bag of seeds to somebody else so they start to grow their own. They have a cooperative now and they're now selling these potatoes. So the enterprising spirit can be encouraged. And I want to just say how I think that might come about, because if you see people in the developing world, I see kids who can use a mobile phone and a computer better than I can if they can get their hands on these. The world is moving eastwards and southwards. And unless we have a really strong concern for solidarity, then we're setting the seeds for a terrible world in the future. If, on the other hand, we have solidarity, we are going to have the sort of environment that we need for enterprise to strive. Let me just say this. The private sector has a major contribution to make. The global GDP increased by a factor of 7 over the first 1800 years of the Common Era, and since then has surged 70 times. So the social market economy does work, but only if it's ethical. And that's another thing, another word we should not be afraid of. Look what happened when we as legislators and regulators and business people didn't behave ethically. I had, as an MEP, a man come to my office from a major mining company in London to canvass me to say, you cannot introduce this legislation requiring project accounting to stop massive bribery in mining in a part of the world because we cannot do project accounting. I think he was very surprised when I said, you're lucky, man, I'm not your chief executive. I'd fire you if you could not tell me how much money we are making on this project. So forget that sort of approach. If we want enterprise to survive, enterprise has to operate on an ethical basis. Thankfully, that's what most business people want. It's what most politicians want. And I think that that's what we have got to encourage. Now, I want to just mention, because we lose you if we all go on at great length, I want to mention 4 ideas that I think would work only if there is a structure to actually implement them. Because I think one of the problems we have is that there is too much ad hocery. I'm not going to go through the facts and figures. Incidentally, disaster is not just an issue for the developing world. In fact, the effect per capita in Europe of disasters can be among the highest in the world because Europe is so densely populated. So a lot of what we have to say here works around the world generally. But I want to make a couple of 4 points in particular where I think, 4 areas where I think the public sector and the private sector could cooperate. And I'm glad that Damon mentioned one of them, because I was the rapporteur, the MEP in charge of what is called the Development Cooperation Instrument, the DCI, which is the basic law for EU funding in the developing world. The European Union and its member states fund 52% of all developing world investment and humanitarian aid. The problem is that in the area of disaster risk reduction, it almost always comes from the humanitarian aid. In other words, we come after the event. I was also rapporteur for the emergency food instrument, and within 100 days we had to find €1 billion and pass a law, and they told me this couldn't be done. We did do it. Now we had to do a bit of creative accounting and steal money from here and money from there. The secret to it was to threaten to take it from the agricultural policy, and then everybody agreed, no, leave the agricultural policy alone, we'll find the money. And we found the money. But that's all ad hocery. We've got to get away from that, and we've got to get to the stage where we fund disaster risk reduction from the development budget and from main budgets in other regions outside of the European Union. One of the areas that I got written into the DCI was that we can, out of development funding, fund insurance and reinsurance projects. And I think this is something, Damon mentioned it, it's something I've been pushing, and I think it's something we can really do something about. I insure. I'm sure most of us here insure. People in parts of the developing world, how do they insure? They insure by having large families to provide for them into the future. That's what they think will provide for them in the future. And it's worse than that. Large male families. There are 200 million women missing from the world's population due to gender-based abortion and infanticide. Because there's this idea that men, this is not incidentally just in the developing world, also in Europe, that men somehow have a contribution to make which will secure you in your old age. Why, if we can find money after the event, like €1 billion in 100 days, why can't we be more creative and say, how can we sit down with the industry? And yesterday I was one of a small group that had breakfast with the Secretary General and the Vice President of the Commission for Budgets, the European Commission for Budgets, the former Humanitarian Aid Commissioner, so she knows exactly what it's about. And if we keep talking in fora like that and like this about insurance and get the industry together with organisations like the European Commission and the UN at a high level. We can find the money. In my country, I don't know what it's like in other countries, we have, for example, export credit insurance. So if you're exporting, say, beef, which is important to our economy, to Iraq and it all blows up, well, there's an insurance policy which ultimately the government will guarantee. We've got to start thinking about these sort of approaches, not just crop insurance, but perhaps life insurance. I really feel that in the area of insurance, that we can do much more to have a partnership than we are doing. Second thing, and I mentioned this briefly, in the developed countries, what is a disaster? A disaster is you come down some morning, you turn on the tap, and there's no water. We take it all for granted. Who provides that water? Local government provides that water. Who provides good infrastructure? Local government. Who provides sewage facilities and waste facilities? Local government. Local government even knows about culture. I believe as part of all of this, not just a partnership between private sector and government, but private sector and government and local government. Why don't we twin every local authority in Europe or in the developed world with local authorities in the developing world? With Skype now, we can give people information. And there are people who will give their time. Engineers gladly will give their time, if only they knew where to give it. The third thing I want to mention is this. It's about land tenure. You all know that Ireland is divided. There's Northern Ireland and there's the Republic of Ireland. The Titanic was built in Belfast. There was no such place as Northern Ireland when the Titanic was built, incidentally. It was built in Ireland. But how did Ireland become divided? And this is an interesting story which is very relevant to private investment. For political reasons, the British government planted largely a Protestant population in the northeastern part of Ireland in what was largely a Catholic country. 700 years ago, we're all living there very happily. I don't know what my own religious background would have been 700 years ago, so it's not the point I'm making. The point is, in order to get them to settle, they gave them almost universally a small piece of land. In the rest of Ireland, what is now the Republic of Ireland, we had large ranches with absentee landlords who literally milked their tenants to death. We had a huge famine, as I mentioned earlier, in the 19th century. We were exporting food. When a quarter of our population died, another quarter left. But in the northeastern part, they had grown flax. They'd sold the flax on the international market. They'd used the capital to invest in industry. Shipbuilding and aircraft building became part of what was Belfast. The city became dominant and the countryside depended on the city. In the rest of Ireland, Dublin at that time depended on the poverty-stricken countryside. Land tenure matters. Now Ireland is a different place, of course, a diversified economy, one of the wealthiest economies in Europe, and the shoe is slightly on the other foot. But the point I'm making is this. If we give people land tenure, not big ranches, a little piece of land, that becomes capital, that becomes collateral. They don't build houses then in ravines, and when the earthquake comes, they're devastated. And we can work together with the private sector to figure out ways of giving people land tenure. It was a big issue in the history of my country. I believe that would make a huge difference. Give people some capital to get out of the poverty they're in. And the last point I want to make is this. Gladstone was an extraordinary British Chancellor of the Exchequer. He became British Prime Minister on 4 occasions, the longest serving British Prime Minister ever. When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he introduced what was called the Exchequer and Audit Department Act 1866. And what he said in that act was this: we cannot spend money the way we've been used to spending money, because there was a lot of scandals at the time. Parliament is the last portion of the circle of control. Parliament takes the money from the people, it entrusts it to government, therefore it's not finished until we account the Parliament. Created the Office of Controller and Auditor General and the Public Accounts Committee. And that was fine, but it was regulatory audit. Did you get €100 million from Parliament to buy ships? Did you buy those ships? And have you got receipts for them? Regulatory audit. That has all changed now. I couldn't read that. I think you mean I should finish. I will finish, though. That has all changed now. Now we have value for money auditing based on 3 E's: economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. The private sector can help us as parliamentarians to require government to spend the money. Do you know, in disaster risk reduction, I thought the Development Bank says that the return on investment is 4 for every euro you invest. The Secretary General said over breakfast yesterday, actually it's 7. And somebody else said, in some instances, it's 35. Value for money auditing and disaster risk reduction are 2 things whose day has come, and the private sector can help us to implement that in the public sector and to find the funds we need for investing. Thank you very much indeed.